Hi, Danielle. Welcome to this week's episode.
Hi there. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
Good.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Brilliant. Great to see you again.
You too.
So this week, we've covered, I think topics that are inspiring and feel good, and topics that dive in deep and go to those messy places that sometimes it's hard for us to look at.
hmm
So tonight, it's come up for me this week, and I think it's come up for quite a few people as well. Seems to be the thing to talk about, which is about grief.
Right. Yeah.
So before I sort of enter the space as to why that seems to have become prominent, and obviously there are things happening in the world, and we're not unaware of what that's about, but it just seems to be that this is the time to talk about this. I'd really like you to share the poem that you wrote, which is right on point on that topic. So,
Right. Right.
like to go
Okay.
ahead. I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. All right. And the poem is titled Grief. Grief is like a dagger sinking into the skin. Grief is like not knowing when it will end. Grief is like releasing all that you are not. Grief is like saying goodbye to all it is that you thought.
That's beautiful, that, Danielle. Thank you.
Well, absolutely.
Because even as you were reading it, I could feel that really deeply. And I was reflecting a lot this week on grief, because I'm thinking, why is it when I hear some things that isn't directly about me or anything that's going on in the family get to me so deeply?
Mm.
And I had a colleague that I'm working with closely at the moment email me yesterday and say, they need to have some time out, because their good friend of hers and her husband had committed suicide.
Mm.
And I was like, wow. And you know what, Danielle, I've been in the mental health fields, working with adults, parents, children for 20 odd years. And these, uh, I've worked with all sorts of issues, but when I hear about suicide, it gets me every time.
Right.
It is so sad.
It is
And
one of
it,
the saddest deaths
yeah.
that there is. It's just,
And yeah, oh, and
yeah,
all grief, all death, and we're not just talking about grief in terms of loss of life and the way
right.
that that life was lost. With grief means all sorts of things. But and on and then another colleague tells me that they've now got to go and visit the hospital because they're suspecting that some of the symptoms they're having may be similar to symptoms they've had before, and they'd had cancer before, and they'd had an operation. And at the same time, I had a friend call round, and it was the anniversary of both her mum and dad passing. And
Mm.
every year, they go and visit the grave and they put flowers on the grave. And it just seemed like, wow, something's rolling here. And I stepped back and thought, um, with everything that we've seen on the news, and as you know, I don't tend to watch the news much, but I'm aware of what's happening now. I
Good
go and
idea.
check out what's happening in different countries,
Right.
So I was looking at what was happening in India and South America and the UK, and the amount of people that are losing their lives. And I had a colleague last week also say to me that, we've been in the field of mental health for a while, and we know that there's been waiting lists, and the needs of children and young people have escalated
Mm.
over the last 5 years, and we're seeing more and more children needing to get access to professionals that can support them in different ways around anxiety or depression. But self-harm was quite a common one, even when I was running services. And self-harm is not always connected to suicide. It's not a direct correlation, but we would also see young people where they had attempted to take their own lives, whether that was on the spur of the moment, whatever the reason was. So when my friend told me, colleague told me about that news this week, I just like your poem, it just cuts deep. It's deep, and it reminds me of the other times, because my son's had a friend who sadly was murdered. I think this is going back about a year, and it affected the whole of the community, because they used to play football together. They were in the same football team. They would play every week, and prior to that, other situations that had happened, where it's either a family member. And then I was thinking about the different types of loss that you experience, because if you've had a close relationship with the grandma, for example, or a cousin or an auntie, the relationship's deeper and more poignant and more significant. So those whole different types of experiences I was reflecting on. But I don't know what it is, but I think the suicide one is the one that just is the one that is the saddest.
Right.
Not that there is a value difference between them.
There's not a hierarchy to it.
No.
But it's how the one that affects you deeply. Yeah.
And possibly, because even though I've been comfortable with these topics, or I've spoken many times to different professionals about all the different things that come up for people in the work that I do. It's just those moments. And again, I remember being at work, this was about 2014, and there was a lad that went missing in the local area, and I couldn't even talk to my manager at that time. It was, I think he was similar age to my boys at the time, maybe a year's difference, 2 years difference.
So it was definitely hitting home for you. In that way.
It wasn't, it wasn't my relative, it wasn't my child, but it's just something that you feel sometimes, isn't it, for the people?
Well, yeah, especially, I don't want to limit this to just the feminine, but because I have that experience as a woman with children, there's something about a loss of a child that affects you on a deeper plane, because you can't help but reflect how you would feel if that were the situation in your existence. And so as a mother, I know anytime that I come across something that's local or close to home in that way, it kind of puts me at a pause to kind of dig deeper and realize how important my children are, how important my family is to me, and how I couldn't even begin to imagine that type of loss or pain associated with that loss.
Yeah. And it's something that, I would struggle to comprehend for too long, because I think sometimes you don't want to comprehend it because it's too big. And I think that's the thing.
Too big. Yeah. That's a massive undertaking to even grasp the concept of, let alone understand where you would be inside of that, because you don't want that experience. You don't even want to tap into that experience because it's deep feelings that none of us want to feel.
Yeah. It's too much to comprehend. And it kind of got me thinking, because part of that reflection about my colleague, because initially, it's, are you okay? If you need anything, contact me. And these are words sometimes that we use when we want to support somebody, but we know what can we do? How can we help that person who is experiencing something that is so tremendously overwhelming and
so personal,
so gut wrenching that, and I think that's the thing. It sort of brings out that feeling as well of that impotence of not being able to do anything, not being able to take the pain away, because you kind of know, don't you, that it's so overwhelming, that pain, that it is
it's
immense.
A very dark box of a room that doesn't have much room available, and and it's just constantly swirling inside of you and around you. It's a dark place,
a really tough place. So so I'm aware of those things, that whether that is a colleague, and it just it was like, why, this week it's been what, 3 colleagues, close friends, things on the news. So that's people that people in your community or people in other countries where you just see the impact. And at the moment, I think we are seeing this on a mass scale.
100% we are. Yeah. You are right in
This is
alignment with
big.
that. It is huge.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we haven't been, we don't come equipped in today's society with the understanding on, the basic understanding on how grief works, why it feels the way it does. And we've been taught to kind of run from grief as opposed to just sit and say, hey, what is ways that, nobody wants to research how to deal with grief. Nobody, that's just it's like death. You don't want to face your own mortality in a lot of ways. So you don't teach.
It's easier not to know, easier to turn away.
Yeah. Cause ignorance is bliss in a lot of ways until that's no longer ignorance because it's in your face.
Because it's in your face.
Because you're experiencing the grief now, or maybe you're witnessing a very close person in your life experiencing the grief. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I am not equipped for this. I've never learned how to take these things and put them into some type of tangible form to help, another person or yourself. It's just something that we tend to shy away from.
Yeah. And you're making a good point, because it depends on where you've grown up culturally, how those experiences are perceived within that system, how they're responded to. And I think certainly in our family, one, because we were quite a small family, so if you're in a big family, multiple generations, you're going to come across it, you're going to be part of it, but then it's how the family responds, how they have conversations about that. And so we can look back at our experiences, and sometimes we just really don't know how to manage things because we're in a different cultural context, or we haven't had the opportunity to be able to really share that deep pain that you can feel, because we know that it can make other people awkward, that you can see that it's difficult for them.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable to we've all experienced some form of grief in our life, but from a personal experience, I don't want to sit there and make another person uncomfortable by telling them about the storyline of how I adopted 3 new kids. Like that's a very incredibly dark and deep, and brings up all the uncomfortable feelings for the person that that's witnessing what I'm saying. And so then you become even more, I guess, introverted in the grief system itself, because you don't feel comfortable handing it over to somebody.
Yeah, you can get locked down almost internally. You end up holding on to that, or you struggle with it on your own because you're conscious either of the attempts that some people make, and you might not see them again, and other people make those attempts, and we're not ready to sit with those people because everyone will go through that process in different ways. And I think that's the thing, there's so much built into how people expect themselves to respond. If it's, whether it's a close family member or something's happened at work or something we've watched, however that's affected us, there's that expectation that we are meant to respond in a particular way. And certainly around the early days, because I remember reading quite a lot years ago about, people would be writing stories and they'd be saying, they don't get upset, they don't cry, and everyone thinks that maybe they're not affected or that they don't care or whatever because somebody's not crying. And in other communities, everybody's crying and everyone's making a lot of noise, and other people don't understand that. So there's all of those different phases you go through, and in my relationships with my colleagues, I'm mindful that we haven't got those deep personal relationships where I can pop round in the way that I might have done we have got geographical stretches of time now because we're not working in the same area. So it makes it difficult in that sense. And at the same time, you know, who are we doing it for? Am I doing it because I don't like to feel my own impotence and watch somebody else in pain? But at the same time, you know, I'm recognizing that there's just so many people out there that are going to be experiencing this loss on a very big level, because obviously lots of people are taking their own lives, or people's lives are being taken because of the pandemic.
Right. And that was on a mass scale as well.
Yeah.
You know, and we could get into the details of it, but we'll just generalize that this was, you know, what we would call the pandemic deaths. And if we generalize it in that way, there was a lot of loss, you know, and we're not talking just death. You know, it was the loss of the way we lived life, and it was the loss of jobs, and it was a loss of homes, and it was a loss of like
what you know.
Yeah, this firm reality that we had in front of us is no longer the reality we have in front of us, and we have to grieve that process, because when your life shifts from external factors, it takes you for a loop, and you have to adjust, and you have to allow the feelings to flow, because grief is the one place that I learned deeper than anything else, that you have to allow your feelings. There is no logical or analytical way to work out. Now, can you help logically and analytically inside of yourself? Absolutely. I'm always going to say that you should use both sides of your brain. But the reality is that those feelings are untapped. Those feelings are from a very deep place. And those are, it's difficult. You know, we start off with talking about, you know, the loss of a life, but even the loss of a job is grievable, especially if that job was your livelihood and this is how you moved forward in your life. Then you no longer have access to that aspect that you're going to have. There's a grieving process inside of that, and that involves anger and sadness and confusion and chaos, and you know, all of the things that make up grief. Grief is an entity all on its own, and we have to learn slowly but surely how to face that before it decides to face you.
And I think the common factor in whether it's a loss of somebody that's close or in the community, or something that you're watching on TV, or the loss of a job, or the loss of a relationship, that common factor that you highlighted, it's the loss of the reality that you knew. So whether that is something that's expected and anticipated, that, you know, you're going to lose your job or somebody's very sick, it doesn't make it any different. It's a huge knock to the whole sense of your own being and who you are, and the definition of who that person was, or what that thing is that meant something to you. Because when I was working with kids years ago, I remember going through this phase when I was working in secondary school, when it just seemed like every week I had a young teenager coming to me that grandma or mum, or the amount of sickness, you know, the amount of kids that had a parent where there was cancer, or, you know, granny was dying or something. And I was like, is it just this school that I'm working in? Is it that I'm just getting those kids? Because you can sometimes end up working with people where you get sort of common topics, common things. And each time, because I was working in a Catholic school at the time, so I think the religion often, whether you're religious or not, the religion can provide a framework in which to have a language to define what the cultural norms are for that group, what the expectations are, what the rituals are. And I think something that has a framework, cultural norms, rituals, expectations, can sometimes make it easier, because people have that in which to sit in. But each time with each person, I'd say, well, what does this mean to you? How do you experience this? Were you close to them, not close? What's your perspective, your sense of it? How are you making sense of this? And then that was the other thing. They, wouldn't be able to make sense of it. It was overwhelming. It was confusing. And they are the very early stages. That's the early stages of that grief. And I remember equally when my mum died, it was difficult because she was 200 miles away from where I was living. I had small children. I was going up and down to visit her all the time. She was sick in hospital for a while, but she wasn't sick as in we were expecting that her life was going to end. Nobody knew that for a moment.
Right.
But the grief of that and the experience of that, it's only when you start to get some hindsight you can see how massively these things affect you. Because I remember, I remember the death itself and being uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, seeing my mum dead, in the hospital room. I was not expecting that, and how different and how disturbing it feels.
Yeah.
And you don't want to, I didn't want to see that. I didn't want to be in there. I wanted to remember her as the vibrant, funny lady that she could be. And then the whole process of all the conversations you've got to have, whether you want to have them or not, and who does X, Y, and Z in terms of clearing things. They're all the practical things, and what kind of burial, or all of those practical things that come up in that first week. And I remember feeling really strongly after my mum died, and when my mother-in-law died as well, of the limbo between this state of where you were that you're never going to be again, and the other space that you don't know what it's going to look like, because all you're in that moment is that dark, painful place. And then whoever you're with gives you an indicator of how open or closed the system you're in is, then when you see it, as to how you're experiencing your own grief, and and how people respond to you, and how you feel your own pain. And like what you say, do you acknowledge it's totally perfectly acceptable and normal to be feeling what you're feeling? Or have you always had people who say, don't cry, don't get upset, don't feel what you're feeling? And it's a complicated, complex process that sits within so many different realms, that's so overwhelming and so difficult often for people to bear. And I think that's what I noticed mostly out of that as well, is that sometimes it's just so unbearable.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm reminded of sometimes, that when my colleague told me that this friend had, and I've no idea as to what's led up to that. Not that there's ever any, in my head, better or worse reason for doing so. But it's that it's just hard to comprehend. It's hard to, because that's how it feels when you're in the grief.
Yeah.
It's a tough place.
And it's like I also picked up that, say you've had a specific type of loss, and it's almost as if it becomes its own tribe in itself, where those who have grieved that type of loss, you almost become like a little club. And those, because they've experienced that, they kind of know how to navigate the field because they've been there, or they kind of know that, this loss that you're experiencing is going to hit right here because they've been in that place. But you're right. Grief is it's a teacher, just like any other feeling. It teaches, but its lessons are so deep and profound that a lot of us are so busy running away from that lesson that we forget that, this is to teach us how that our love was pure, and this grief that we're feeling is love, and it's that love lost. And to understand the depths of your love is understanding the depths of this grief, and it, how it correlates with each other. And when you don't have a community to surround you, or you don't have the people you thought that would be there for you in times of grief. It teaches you a lot of resilience and what you're capable of, and why it, you're a pillar of strength. And even if it doesn't feel like that, trust me, when I lost my mom, I wailed and screamed and cried for hours. I fell on the ground, and but I stood back up, and I knew that, from my own experiences of the little bit that I learned throughout the years and the pattern, we pick up on things as you get older, somebody's going to know somebody that lost somebody. And taking those little bits of information that I had, and I standing back up and wiping myself off and saying, I know this comes in waves.
Yes.
And in between the waves, I have to stand up and I have to do this stuff. And then when the wave hits, I allow myself the rest, and I allow myself to sit back and to feel the feeling. It's important. Grief is an important lesson in life that nobody wants to learn.
And I think you highlight a really important point is, if we've grown up in a community where there are norms and standards as to how we navigate different stages of life, it can be incredibly supportive. It can be limiting as well. It's supportive because you've got some map as to how things are going to go, what direction they're going to go in, and then some understanding of that experience will pass. But when you experience it, because I remember walking up the stairs and being hit all of a sudden with this intense grief 8 months later. But because I'd gone, it was like going around in a circle, and then I'd be free of it, and then around in a circle, and I'd be free of it. And these waves of emotions would just come over me. But because I'd experienced it several times before, it doesn't make it feel any better. But I could take myself out and go, right, okay, you need some time out, and experience that fully. And I think, and I've said this to a few colleagues and a few friends, it doesn't stay with the level of intensity, and it doesn't stay where it's a full-time experience,
right?
But it never disappears completely.
No,
You are forever changed.
I teared up just talking about the experience of losing my mom. And because it's always going to remain this piece of you that, in whatever grieving experience, it's always going to have this piece of you that you no longer have, because it's changed and it's rearranged. And so that is always, that prick of pain is always going to be there, but the intensity of the pain does subside. The intensity of the waves washing in are going to slow down and be a little softer, and the tide will come out and the tide will come back in. And this is just part of the grief experience. And, we deserve to know that all of the feelings, and sometimes non-feelings we have inside of grief, are normal. There is not a booklet that states the rules of grief, because we are individuals experiencing the grief in the way that we experience it, through conditioned behavior, through, societal understanding, through the religious groups that you're in, through the people that you're surrounding, the circumstances you're in. Like, there was time I remember saying to my husband, I think I've cried all my tears. I don't think I can cry anymore. And I didn't cry for weeks on end. And it was wild to me, because here I am in my head thinking, but I'm supposed to cry. And because I wasn't, I thought that there was something wrong with me. But then the tears came again, and that wave came back through, and it was like, okay, I'm very in touch with that, acknowledging that was a moment of respite for me, that although I was feeling still the feelings, I wasn't breaking down in those moments. And even though I assumed that I should be, the reality was I wasn't. I had my focus in another department at that point. And so when I was able to shift that focus, the feelings came right back. The tears began to flow again. So having a non-feeling is okay as well, to not respond and say, well, it is what it is, and I accept it for what it is. And moving forward is just as much a valid grief response as sitting inside of a puddle of your own tears and sadness.
Well, exactly what you say. We're individual, and that you can work out there's a sort of pattern to it. However, every experience of grief I've had has been different. My very first memory of it was a man that was a neighbor. He became like a granddad. And I was only about 8, but I'd never seen anyone die, never experienced it before. And when he passed, we were incredibly close. I was absolutely devastated for days. And I don't remember how we got through that. Maybe we just stopped talking about it. I'm not sure. And then my experience of when my dad died, I felt very little. When my mum died, it was different to when my mother-in-law died. But I think the bit that probably each time gets me in the same way is when it's a suicide, or when it's been a young person, like when the kids have told me a friend of theirs has died. And for young people, if they've not grown up in a system where they've got that map and they've got a way of navigating that, then it's incredibly difficult for them, because they might be in a system that their feelings are dismissed. They don't realize that it's okay to be non-feeling as well as overwhelmed and feeling lots of things. And they might not necessarily have any history to draw from, or they don't know themselves enough yet to know that we experience differently with all the different people in our lives, because people have different levels of meaning to us. And in strong relationships, just as the way they talk about any relationships, if you break up a partnership, the grief itself is also the drawing back of the chemical to do with attachment. So if your attachment has been really good and it's a strong attachment, even if it's a complicated attachment, the grief can feel complicated. You can have the feelings of hate and love, of peace and happiness, as well as sadness. And I remember having that experience at one time, and I understand the psychology behind it, but my brain was still saying, what is going on? I feel all of these different feelings. It wasn't straightforward. It wasn't linear. It dived in and out in different ways. I still revisit these edges and corners of this experience. But each time, some of them you could experience and move through. And like you say, sometimes when you're with a group of people, it's much easier can be much easier to share that in some ways, because you're with that group of people. Or it can be inhibiting if you're quite a private person and you don't show your emotions in public, and you have a certain way of viewing all this. So I think, in a way, one of the reasons I wanted to bring this forward tonight is that, life is about death and birth and marriage and all of these phases that we go through. But I think in this last year, we're seeing things on such a high level in terms of the impact that everything has happened globally on people. We're not seeing, and what we see a lot of the time is really tough, in terms of what happens to people in different countries. It's war torn. People are being killed all the time. People are dying all the time.
And the reasons behind why people, that's a rough one for me. Like, this is number one reason I turned off news stations, was because I would find myself grieving for something I had no control over. I couldn't help change if I tried my hardest. And I had to turn off the stations because I knew that was just going to affect me long term in a negative way. And it doesn't take away my compassion. It doesn't take away the need for things to change or any of that. It was just, I realized that it was self-harming for me to be so hyper aware,
to expose yourself to too much of it.
Yeah. To too much of it, and I grew up with a mom that worked in child welfare or CPS. Right. So, there was some stories that, gets heard, and even if it wasn't directed at me, I was a curious child. So I'm listening in, and it's, I could never do that job. I will just state that out of the gate. Whoever does that job, you guys are an angel living on this earth. But, the reality is it part of me hardened to knowing that this is such a common thing. Right. And then part of me realized how sad that is. And it just kind of was like a floodgate of emotion, recognizing that even though if I didn't even know these things personally, or these were affecting me personally, they still created such a trauma fueled sadness inside of me that, I would just have to start taking away the pieces that were not going to help on my journey. And that started at a young age, and then turning off the news helped. And it's not that I'm not aware of what goes on, because I am. It's just that I don't need the media twist to it, the spin. And I definitely don't need it in my face and not being able to help. And that was a big one for me as well, is acknowledging that.
I think you touch on some really key points, though, is that we can be faced with this all the time. And it happens with professionals where it's their line of work and they do that thing every day. So, there's a risk in some where they just become immune to it. So that's where it can be more dangerous if a professional gets so immune that they're not, it becomes just part of every day. The other element of that is we've talked on previous podcasts about if you're a highly sensitive person, you can feels like you can experience the pain and the issues that you're witnessing.
Yeah.
And for highly sensitive people, empathic people, it's part of what makes them really good in their field, if they're in the helping profession, whether that's a coach, a therapist, a nurse, whoever that is, it can make them really good. But we've got to turn down the volume of how much we expose ourselves to as well.
Right. It's true. Because you can't live your life feeling everybody else's pain, especially as you made the statement of, this is part of life. Life is to be born, to live the journey, and the path to the next, realm, however you believe, whatever your beliefs are, is some form of a belief that there is a next thing. And I think we get really caught up in the moment of, this life is the only life. And we forget that there's this next step in our soul's journey that goes beyond this. And of course, I sit in the more spiritual nature of things. And so, for me, it helps in my understanding of grief on all levels, be it a significant other that you broke up with, divorced from, losing a job, to the grieving of somebody very close to you or a family member, is that that the journey with me is now done. And that is what I'm grieving, is my loss of that part of the journey. But the other person is continuing their journey, be it in heaven, be it in their next life, be it in the next, dimension that they live in, the next realm that they get to exist inside of, And so that for me really helped kind of adjust my view on what death is, because really, when we sit and think about it, when we look at grief, we're grieving the loss of something that was our reality.
And that was important to us.
Yeah, that was important to us and our reality and how our reality was formed. And when we can let go of that piece of that and acknowledge that you're also grieving yourself in this, that part of your reality that is gone, we can start making adjustments on how we work inside of our grieving process. And as far as the pandemic goes and everything associated with this, there is a gaping wound right now of loss. And it's not just the loss of in a death way, you know, like I said before, this is the loss of the reality we know. And so this grieving is exactly what grieving is. Your reality is now different. And how do you move through all of the different feelings that are going on within you and within others and navigate this new reality you are now faced with?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I remember last year starting to see what you're describing are the different reactions when the reality, whether you have chose to change that or whether that change has occurred without your control. And all the different reactions I was seeing at the time, if I went on Facebook and quite quickly, within about 2 weeks, turned the news off and turned off Facebook and most of the platforms, but that was the worst one because there was a massive reaction in some communities where people's anger and rage about how other people behaving was manifesting. And the level of judgmentalism and castigation and, you know, all of these behaviors I was seeing. And at the same time, everybody was in the same boat. Everybody was experiencing this lockdown, the shops closing, people at the time
getting sick and dying. Yeah.
Getting sick and dying, the fear kicking in, hearing everything on the news. So this sort of psychological aspect that sits behind that is the reaction to loss and grief, like you say, whether it's your reality or a person, is you can either go numb, you can sit in, you can avoid it, you cannot feel anything, you can feel angry, you can feel rage, you can feel overwhelmed, you can have all sorts of feelings. Now, for me, sometimes if I'm overwhelmed, I can feel spaced out and confused. So I might go out to my usual place of shopping or whatever, make a few mistakes, forget to do something, because the whole of the way we were doing things also changed.
All of
the
it.
way you walked in a shop and how you had to behave, and you had to clean your trolley, and you had to do all these things that we'd never done before. So there was a whole multi-layered extra levels of things we had to consider. And I don't, take to one or two changes sometimes. But I was aware that was me having to pay attention to how I experienced me being in that environment, but also aware of how people had taken it upon themselves to start policing everybody else.
That was a big one for me. That was huge. I remember being in a grocery store, and grocery stores being one of the only things you could go into that's public. It's crowded and you feel uncomfortable because you're unsure of what's going on and how big this is going to be. And, is it as simple as somebody coughs and the whole store's sick, and you can feel the tension in the air. And I am
very stressed.
I'm very sensitive to other people. And I just remember this woman who was clearly in a hurry. There's you couldn't move if you wanted to, you got to keep your distance from people. And if somebody's stopping in the aisle, you can't just bump into and be like, excuse me anymore, because then there's another person to the side of that's a few feet away. And this woman just was like, get out of my way, and just screamed at me. And I was like, okay. And so I just carried on with my business because I'm not going to engage with that behavior. But that just shows you the way that people are so unaware of their feelings that they begin to project
Yeah.
the things that
And
they're
spill
feeling,
out.
and it just spills out onto anybody they come into contact with. Because I had no contact with that woman. I will never have contact with that woman again. In fact, I wasn't even in her way. She just perceived that I was. And so I became the person that she projected this upon.
Yeah.
And that's part of that judgmental nature that we're seeing, that, so, it was like this division yet again, where you had the people that believed in the mask and it was going to be life-saving, and the people that didn't believe in the mask and quoted whatever they could from the internet saying that this is not going to work. And then they're judging each other instead of just accepting that this person to feel comfortable needs it this way, and this person to feel comfortable needs it this way. And we're both dealing with something life-changing for everybody in the way we know how,
with
and the
no forgiveness,
with
no tolerance,
no tolerance.
Yeah. It
and
was
it's bled over. Now companies are doing it. And it's kind of, like the level of judgment inside of this grieving nature is there has to be a stop to it. There really does. And I don't know how or when or why, how that's going to occur, but it is something that as a collective group, we absolutely need to stop projecting our reality. Our uncomfortable feelings, changes in our reality onto other people. You can't expect me to live my life according to your rules. Yeah. Just like I can't expect you to live your life according to your rules. And we're going to grieve differently. We're individuals. We're going to react differently. We're individuals. But we have to learn not to project those things in a judgmental tone onto other people. That allows us to heal. When we're not judging another person, we're not projecting onto that next person, then as a collective, there's like this subtle energy that begins to occur that allows for some healing and understanding and walking into this new version of reality that looks different than it did yesterday.
Yeah. And also the processes involved with the same, that because you see that sometimes when somebody dies and there'll be somebody within the community that has a lot of opinions about how it should be and how it should work and how people should behave and how they dress and what kind of service they should have. And not all of those opinions and judgments can come out. But I think what I was seeing last year was how it had just blown up really in front of my eyes. And it did, I think sometimes you have to, we have to sort of think about how we are in that, how we want to respond, because there were quite a few times where I got triggered and I got upset, and it's like, okay, hang on, Mel, what's going on here? So I changed my shopping habits. I changed the time of day I went. I tried to navigate the system differently. Yeah. But there were a couple of occasions where I did actually, on one of the Facebook pages, where the woman who was actually running the page was having a go at all the women who were going into supermarkets taking their kids. And it got to the point where it got ridiculous. And I'm like, if most of those women were single women and they've been sent home and they've got their children, how on earth are they meant to shop? Right. What they're meant to do? Leave the children.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there's judgment there. Okay. So we have to give these allowances and these understandings outside of our personal perspective. Yeah. These women don't want to take, I don't know a woman, period, that wants to take their children into a grocery store, because it is rough. There is not a kid in this world that's like,
if someone else can look after them. Yeah.
Right.
You're right.
So
yeah.
They don't want to do this. They don't want to put their child in danger, but their child needs food. Yeah. And not everybody has access to the things that we have. Like I was able to get online shopping, where I could just go and pick it up.
We couldn't. It was really difficult.
Right.
There were so many people doing that. Yeah.
But I'm not here to judge the woman or the man that's deciding that, well, I'm alone with these kids and we don't have anything for lunch or dinner. I need to go to the store, but my kids are under a certain age that I don't feel comfortable.
You can't leave them at home, otherwise social services get involved.
Exactly. Because that nosy neighbor over there is probably invested in that, and I'm not saying to leave your kids at home ever. I'm not saying any of that, Nobody should leave a 3-year-old at home by themselves, but it's just because 3-year-olds are wild. But, you know, just to see fights break out because somebody isn't wearing a mask. But if the mask is doing its job, let's look outside of the perspective. You know, if the mask is doing its job, then you needn't concern yourself if that person's wearing a mask or not. This is now you are taking your perspective and insisting that this person only sees it from your side. And what that creates is this chaotic energy that doesn't allow you to express the way you feel and your personal viewpoints and perspective without it being harshly judged. And we'll go back to what you were saying, where there's always that person in the community that's saying, well, they didn't mourn enough, or they should have worn black, or they should have done this, or this should have been this way, the judgments that come out, like that person's going to go to hell because they cremated this person as opposed to burying him. Like, who says, and we saw that on a mass scale. Yeah. So that one person in the community, well, there's a lot of communities. And there's a lot of those someones inside of that community. Yeah. And now on a mass scale, we are creating these people that come out of the woodworks to tell you how you should experience this new reality you're now going into through
when
grief.
Really, the shops have staff who can politely talk to people because it's the rule of the shop and it's their shop. And I think that was the only time, I think I did a couple of things at that time because I always think, if you pose one opinion, there's always a multitude of opinions that come in your direction. But I did post the psychology experiment that had been done in the 60s, I think, about it was done with university students. And it showed what happens. People don't realize that we all have the potential to hurt and harm other people, even if we deny that we do. And this experiment was done in a prison where they,
I know this.
Do you know the one? I don't know if it was Milgram. I might have to look that up. And where they had to administer electric shocks. And even when the person said, stop doing that, they continued. And anyway, I found that experiment and I just posted that online and I said, this is what we're at risk of doing. We're at risk of, so we need to understand ourselves and how we function, and that even if there's norms and behaviors and attitudes that is particular to that cultural group, which in like occasions of grief you can navigate, and it's not perfect by any stretch of it. However, it gives people a reference point and a map. And then what happened last year was every reference point and every map that everybody had, because I live in a very diverse area, so there's many multiple maps that people have in terms of how they view the world and how they walk in their space, now was under the gaze of everybody else in the community who all had opinions.
Yeah,
and I was really
they
struck
all had
by
an
that.
opinion that they were very adamant to speak out about.
Yeah.
And it's okay for us to have an opinion. It's okay for us to have certain judgments. What's not okay is then to project said judgments onto the other people without giving yourself opportunity to look inside of a perspective that doesn't belong to you anymore. It's rough. It's been rough. It's been hard. It's been very divisive. It's been I feel almost like there's this segregation going on between.
Well, that's the risk.
That's the risk. And this is what we're walking into. I was talking to you about this before where, I have a cruise coming up, and if you're not vaccinated, you have to limit the decks you can use. If you're not vaccinated, even though you paid full price for this, you're not allowed onto certain ports. If you're not vaccinated, you're not allowed into certain restaurants. Now what's happening is the exact thing that a free person free to make a choice for their body, for their health, for their well-being, for their family, is now being told that if you do not fall in line into whatever the majority rules mentality, you are now not allowed inside of our space. And so going back to that prison with the university students, I mean, yeah, like, guys, we're in real time right now, seeing how this stuff plays out when we're not aware. Yeah. When we're not aware of self and aware of what our projections are doing to other people and what our fear modules, our fear matrices are doing to other people.
Well, it's exactly that as well, because the thing is that I don't know if we all had a language to be able to communicate what our internal and external worlds are doing, and we can do that from a comfortable place and be heard, whether or not we'd be less inclined to react and respond so vehemently when situations like this come up. And that's what grief does. Anything, and we talked about shock and trauma as well, that what grief will do will also unearth every other grief that experience that you've had, every other trauma that you've had, and you have that on multiple layers. If you don't clear up your energy system, if you don't step back and realize where you're at that day, when I'm overwhelmed, I'm not going to get in the car and go and do some shopping.
Right.
You know, I haven't got small children now, but even then, I might have to walk to the local shop. Everything else would be off the cards. If you're really angry and you're feeling rage and you're going to get triggered, and we can't always predict these things.
Right.
But it's, how do we respond? How do we react to those situations? Where do we not need to get involved with? And this is the difficulty is when you've got things going on a mass level at this scale that it is, this level of grief and fear and trauma that's been activated will make more people behave in irrational ways and come out with decisions that they don't realize what the long-term damage and impact that's doing.
Yeah, it's going to be a big one, and we're going to be taking care of and cleaning up this mess for a long time. They tell you in grief to simplify, right? To take a, when you're grieving, you tend to simplify. It's a natural reaction. You're not going to go out and hang out with your friends. You're not going to, run this extra errand that's not a have to, right? Everything is, if it's not a need or a have to, I'm not doing it kind of vibration when you sit inside the depths of grief.
Yeah.
So what happened on a mass scale wasn't that.
Yes.
We might have gone down to essential workers, but the essential workers was a huge amount of people. And so these essential workers are now not simplifying, living inside of a grief system where the reality is completely changed. And then they have to add on, not take away, add on daily needs to get by, to go to work and to come home. And it's like, we can see where we are as a society and our understanding of what it feels and looks like when your reality has shifted in a massive way.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a lot of work to do, but at the end of the day, when you are faced with the new reality and you're faced with that new reality as something that you didn't have a choice in, and you're now grieving the experience that you had and walking into this new realm that you're now inside of, simplifying is the number one way to get a grip, a grasp, if you will, on what this new reality is. Because if you still try to do everything the way it was, how it was, you're going to notice pretty quickly that you can't. And we took that on a mass level, that we can't do things the way we did. We can't do things the way that our parents did, or, their parents did any longer. This is no longer the reality that we live in. And so compassion is, I call in, on my spiritual side, I call in a deity named Kuan Yin, and Kuan Yin is all about teaching compassion. And I learned about Kuan Yin during this pandemic because compassion was what was needed at this time. Compassion for your fellow human being, compassion for the journey that they're now having to take. Even if your journey, your external world just changed in this blink of an eye with them, your experience to get to that place or to understand that place is going to be completely different. And we have to learn to be compassionate about another person's journey and not so judgmental about you don't have to agree with it. Nobody said you have to be on board with what another person's doing. Simply put, you don't have to project your shit about it. You don't have to say you're wrong. Let a person take on the reality the way they want to.
Unless you're being paid to be a policeman, woman.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a job. That's kind of
what I mean is that that's really the only person that's really meant to, activate the law. The rest of us are meant to be working towards being in harmony with each other so that we can function as a society. And in a way, sometimes that's the gift that comes with grief, is that, when you lose something that's so dear to you, sometimes part of that process is regret, because we haven't we didn't finish the conversations we wanted to have. We didn't go to the places with them we wanted to have. We didn't give them the time or the space that we should have done. And it's that regret, and through that process, that sometimes we realize how valuable the human life was, how valuable those interactions and relationships and quality of relationships are. So it may be that sits within that cultural group and that cultural frame, and that's a protective factor. But when there's a seismic shift of reality, as we've experienced, then we have to understand who we are in relation to the cultural group that we sit in relation to every one of the other human beings that we may stumble across on our journey in our day-to-day lives. And you're right, it's sometimes you have to be able to step back and simplify your process and do the bare minimum, which is what we've talked about before when I've worked with parents and they've got kids, they've got additional needs, is you have to have respites. Being tired, not getting enough sleep, having so much on your plate
into your, into your mind, into your physical field. Those are all things, that's just a recipe for something you don't want to eat. You don't want that. And so
you're more likely to get stressed if you've got triggers of your own, because what we're seeing on a mass scale, whether that's on the news or when we go out, and even though I've always been, for the last 10 years or something, relatively introvert, only being out and about when I was going to work, I still come into contact with people who are driving too close to me, who are cutting me up, who are bumping into me at the supermarket. I mean, I like having 6 foot distance away from people.
As a sensitive human being, I prefer the distance. I agree.
Exactly. So we coming into contact with all of this on our day-to-day basis, let alone if you've got children, you've got to deal with school, you've got to deal with homework, all of this stuff. So we've got to be able to do that from a place of a decent level of functioning. And if we're not functioning because we're overwhelmed and something's happening in our personal lives. Now, when my colleagues told me this has happened to them, it wasn't my relative, it wasn't in my life. I could feel what I was feeling and sit back in the chair and notice and reflect on what is it about that makes me feel the sadness or the pain that I was feeling. What is it about that when I get those other reminders that I experience, what is it about that? At that moment, I'm not then going to go out and about and do stuff because I'm feeling more vulnerable or I'm feeling out of sorts. Or I contact a friend or a colleague and I have a chat with them, because talking through things sometimes can make a difference. And it stops it. It doesn't necessarily give the answer to anything or solve any problems, but it can give you some clarity as to what you need to do right now.
Right. Well,
But
and it
the
doesn't allow the
intense,
ego to form an entire made up reality that's not in existence,
yeah,
so when you get it out to somebody else, it kind of clears that.
yeah, or
Yeah.
the one that is the default mechanism. Yeah, because often when we're stressed, we can fall into a default mechanism. And if you're the kind of person that will react and respond and think later, then you're more likely in these circumstances to do that. And I think that's the evidence of what we were seeing. Now, I could sit back and see it's a normal part of that process that people were going through. Where
Right.
I choose to place myself is another thing. And I've got
Right.
several friends who were out there on the front line, that were dealing with members of the public all the time, putting themselves at risk, and they
Right.
had to do that
And I
to earn
applaud
their
them.
money. And that
Right.
was huge for them. Their
Yeah.
lifestyles and way of
Yeah.
working has massively changed. So it's, I don't know. I sort of feel like this is like grief is a process, and we will revisit it at different times. This is
Yeah.
possibly something we're going to revisit because every country's at a different phase and managing the whole pandemic thing differently.
Right.
So it'll affect communities in different ways because it depends on how aligned the community is with the instructions and ideas as to what's going on with the government. But where I live, there's a lot of people in the communities that also have relatives in Africa and India. So even if we are, maybe something isn't happening to us directly, we've got family members, and only this week, a colleague of mine who's got family out in South Africa, and then I read on the news about some of the things that are happening in South Africa. They'd been,
Mhm.
I don't know what it is. I can't use the right language because I don't know the story full enough. I know how the media portrays it,
Right. Right.
but it was a worrying situation. And, now I know my friend's now going to be worried about her parents, let alone that they can't fly freely now because
Right.
there's going to be limitations to when they can take the flights and tests they've got to have. So these are all situations that people are still having to navigate. They're
Constantly.
having to navigate so many different things still. So I think there's no easy answer or solution to any of those life experiences that,
Yeah.
as we were saying earlier, are perfectly normal within the cultural context you're in. But what isn't normal at the moment is all of these new things we're having to navigate, and we
Yeah.
need to tap into that compassion more than any
Absolutely.
any any time in history, probably.
Well, not only compassion, but this was the perfect opportunity to become a little more self aware, right? This was the perfect opportunity to witness yourself and your reaction to how things unfolded, what it is that triggered you, what the trauma response was, where we're conditioned, where we find the fear inside of these things. I was made very aware of my uncomfortable feelings I have with my government during the pandemic and the types of fears that came out of me inside of that. And that was very similar to these grief type feelings that I had when I lost my mom.
Yeah,
You could start to draw the lines because I paid attention and I allowed myself to become an observer. I allowed myself to become aware of the places that said ouch. And I was, the things that went, this doesn't feel right. Why doesn't this feel right? I'm scared. Why am I scared? And it allowed these opportunities. And if there was the biggest lesson inside of any type of grief, it is the hindsight lesson, which is when you look back and you start to navigate all of those different fields of vision that you had, the waves of pain, the waves of resistance, the waves of, breakthrough moments of, okay, I can get through this. What you did that you would like to see improve, and what you did that you say, I feel like I've mastered this. And I think that if something were to ever happen to me in this realm again, I would be equipped a little bit better. And, as a society, it's really time for us to stop pointing that finger because we're all grieving. We're all changing reality right now. But if we stop pointing the finger and start realizing that these behaviors are something from within, and that we can't judge that in another, and that we are here, we have to sit here and say, look, we need to work together collectively to work through. You said it just a minute ago. There's only a few people that are here to enforce the law. The rest of us are to work together and try to find harmony. And I'm not seeing a lot of harmony throughout the world right now in this. I see a lot of finger pointing. I see a lot of blame. I see a lot of shaming. And as a person, as people that have been through grief, those are the last things that you need to have coming at you when you are grieving a reality you once held dear.
Yeah. And, I was going to make that point as well, because I don't know why the person I found out about this week took his life.
Right.
And I don't know why people that have come through my service before have taken their life. And when I worked at Samaritans, I heard the different reasons, the different pain that people was experiencing. So we don't know when we're walking down the road or going into the supermarket or parking the car. We don't know whether that person that we've come into contact with, that we want to maybe point the finger at and have a judgmental response to. And it is normal. We do have those thoughts. We do have those. We're programmed that way broadly. This is why we need to become aware of that, because we need to become aware of the program. But we don't know what happened. And one of the most powerful things I ever watched, and I've been involved in a lot of training and listened to a lot of stories, but I was doing I was at a conference once with British Rail, and British Rail have they had a training event for all the staff, because one of the biggest issues on the railways is that people jump in front of trains when they want to commit suicide. And because it happens so regularly on some of the lines, the railway system decided that they really needed to run this program. So I was sat in the audience with a load of other professionals, and they were playing it's like an advert, and and you can hear the music, and like Jaws, you start to hear the music and you're like, oh, you know what's coming. I was sat in the audience and they started to play the music, and it was about 5 different people, different shots. A mum getting up and getting the kids breakfast, and a dad getting his stuff ready for work, and a single guy and a young person, all different shots. And you kind of knew what was coming, because every one of them, that might have been their last day, because they all had thoughts, they had things going around in their heads. And the screen started to show them walking towards the train station, because of course, like I said, it's where a lot of the suicides are happening. And it was so striking, because the message for the staff is that when the man or the woman was stood by the bridge overlooking the railway track, what they were teaching the staff to do was to notice that, to notice the pain, to notice how they were walking, to notice what was going on, and walk up and say, are you okay? Is everything all right? Can you talk to me? And that action alone has saved quite a lot of lives, because people have realized compassion. And it's never left me. And there's a few things I've watched, it's never left me.
Yeah.
And so it's very poignant, very poignant. And it's exactly that. And equally, when I was working in secondary schools, when social media became the thing that all the teenagers were using, this was, I'm going back 15 years. And I would hear news of, one of the girls or guys that I was working with in the school hadn't turned up, because that weekend she'd ended up in A&E, because they tried to take their own life, because they'd gone to a party and done something stupid, but everyone had posted it over social media. And I would be, this is where I used to get mad as anything. And I started dragging all the all the kids into my office. Do you know the impact that your behavior is having
Right.
on
You
this
have to take some
person?
responsibility inside of
Yeah.
that,
You've
because the
got to
reality
stop.
is people make mistakes, right? And we now live in an age.
Yeah.
You and I didn't grow up like this. We didn't grow up with cell
And it
phones.
was
We didn't.
hard enough going to school back then.
Yes, because it was, I mean, the bullying was very active even
Yeah.
then, but now
Yeah.
you are not even safe at home because it goes onto social media, and that's like the internet's forever.
Yeah.
And
And it's displayed and hundreds of people see these
that's just
posts.
heartbreaking to me. I love that you were able to teach them, that you were able to like give them that lesson, because it probably was life-changing for a lot of them. Like the reality of what you do impacting another person in that way.
That's how I used my rage. I was so incensed and enraged at what I was seeing, what I was witnessing, and at times couldn't believe that the schools were bypassers. They were watching this unfold. And I'm like, we have to challenge this. So several times actually I did that in the school, and I would bring them all in a room, and whatever the behavior was, because whether it was racist behavior or whether it was somebody had done something silly that maybe teenagers do at that age, and nothing, they would have got over it at the weekend, but because everybody had laughed at them so much. And you're right, you're talking about shame and all of those feelings that are evoked that people will work really hard to hide, and then you don't see that person again, or it takes them weeks and months to recover. And everyone's got different levels of resilience. And so last year, everyone's worried about their job. Everyone's worried about whether they can get the kids to school. Nobody knew if they were, if there were going to be food on the shelves.
Yeah, and even those were legitimate concerns. They literally were telling you to prepare for, like, start preparing to grow your own food kind of information.
Because we might not have it.
Yeah. And here, majority of humans live in cities where they don't have access to things like that. So of course, we have to and this is something I'm very passionate about, and I'm trying to keep myself with my alignment of who I am. But we have to be self-aware of ourselves, and inside of that,
this has got to grow,
that not everybody is where you're at. Not everybody takes on fear the way you take on fear. Not everybody is equipped to handle embarrassment the way you are. Not everybody is equipped to be proud of their culture because they've been taught not to be. Not everybody is. And so the best thing that we can do as a human being walking this earth
is know that.
Is know that, because would you want that happening to you?
Exactly.
And I don't want to ever hear, well, I would never do that. But you've done something like that at the same energetic response, at the same energetic level, and you are capable. Everyone's capable of being cruel.
That's what experiment. Yeah, that's what experiment showed, and they know that. Behavioral science has done enough studies to know.
We just keep ourselves ignorant to what the science is proving, and mass media is not helping with that. They're fueling that. Exactly. Teaching, conditioning us to be judgmental, conditioning us to take sides, conditioning us to be divisive. And we have to take it upon ourselves to say, hey, I'm easily influenced. I know I am. I'm easily conditioned. It's part of my human design. I acknowledge this. I recognize this. I know that I have open energy centers that just like to be like, ooh, yum, yum, yum. I'm just going to take it all in. It's not all good. So part of what we have to do.
But you've recognized that, though. Yes. And you've taken steps on your journey to rectify that.
Individually recognize that you are conditioned as a human. You're easily conditioned, and you have to decide what your conditioning is going to be.
Well, I'm only going to mention this once ever in our podcast, okay? And we'll refuse to have conversations about several things. However, I've got to say this, is that Trump, as for whatever people think of him, good or bad, all he did was state what a lot of people thought and felt.
That'll be the only time I say it myself. I agree with your
Yeah.
statement on Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So however we define his politics, his way of being, his behavior, his psychology, all of that, I don't need to go into. That has been analyzed to death, literally.
Yes.
However, I think it's very, and again, it's we have to notice what's the reaction we're having to the information we're hearing, whether we're watching it on the news. We go through an array of feelings. If you watch the news, number one, they've got music, they've got light, they've got keywords, and you can watch something about countries where the kids are having to walk for miles to get water, or on the next scene there's a war scene and the buildings are blowing up. So the first one is impotence and you don't know what to do, or compassion, and the next one is horror and rage, and then on the next scene it's something about a donkey, and then that's not being fed for months, and on the next scene, and we're given this diet of all of these images,
right,
and we can get locked into all of those different feelings, and we need to start noticing. And TV, let's utilize it for what it is. It's an emotional evoker. So let's utilize that information and see how we experience that to give us a gauge on who we are and where we're at. Because I know if I'm watching something and I get very have a strong response to that, I feel emotional, just like when my colleague will share some information with me.
right.
I didn't respond to them straight away. I collected myself first. They don't need to hear my pain and my grief.
No.
You can share that with friends, but because that's mine, and for whatever reason. And the same as if my boys were going through, when they were going through it, and it went on for a while because it was a police investigation, and it took ages for the funeral to happen. So when they were going through that, they didn't need to see my pain, but
No.
I felt the pain, and it was deep, and it cut me deep, just like what your poem said. So I think that's the thing, is we will get triggered, and this stuff is deep, and we've had eons of it. We've had eons of, family members for all sorts of different reasons have experienced the horror of war, or the losses of job, or famine, and all of these things. We've been fairly protected to some degree in the Western world from that. However, our reality has undergone a 360, or maybe not 360, maybe 355-degree turn. And what happens with that is it sends us into a spiral. And when we're in a spiral, when we're in confused, the brain will reach for whatever it knows.
Whatever it knows.
But we've got to sit back. We've got to sit back, breathe, and notice what's going on. Because if I'm still feeling this stuff and I will get triggered, or I notice what's going on out and about, we can guarantee that pretty much everybody else is. This is time for us to take ownership and responsibility for who we are as humans.
It's who we are as humans, and what we bring to this world, and the ways we project, and the ways that we lack compassion, and the ways that we overgive ourselves in our compassion. And when you focus on the negative, right, all you're going to see in your world is the negative.
Is the negative, yeah.
I am not blinded by my positivity. I am not blinded by the things that are going on in this world. I have chosen to be happy regardless. I have chosen to create my own safe haven, my own Garden of Eden, my own loving, caring, experience inside of this world. And it doesn't have to be based off of what society tells me it needs to be based off of. It doesn't have to be formed around what media tells me is important, or what Facebook tells me is important, or any other social, platform, and so at the end of the day, I know we're talking grief, but the reality, we have to understand that part of grief process is becoming more self-aware. part of the grief process is not only having more compassion for yourself, but having compassion for another. And just because you're inside of grief doesn't mean that the person that you're talking to doesn't have their own grief pattern. Just because you're inside of grief does not make you the center of the universe, that we have to experience this world in the way that it's given to us and not in the way that we expect it to be. And grief will happen. And we're seeing this on a worldwide scale, that grief has happened, and how you react to that grief tells you a lot about yourself and where we are at in society. And in where we are at in society is kind of unnerving for me, because I just watched this whole docuseries on the history of mankind, and we are literally repeating history over and over and over, and we're not learning from it. We're not taking the compassion from it. We're not understanding the depths of human nature inside of this. Instead, we're just saying, well, we might as well make this as hard as possible for everybody since I'm uncomfortable. And that just seems to be the general consensus that's going on right now.
Yeah, it's not in all cases, but in many cases, it's the lack of capacity to manage the intolerance and the intolerable. And yet, it's very small things we do to give a nod to our neighbour that we've got their backs, that we are looking out for them. We don't have to, do that much. And even though I'm fairly insular, I like to know, if I haven't seen my neighbours for a few days, I've knocked on the doors. Are you okay? Do you need anything? If you're sick, I can go to the shop. The same as when I'm in the supermarket. I don't want to stand and necessarily talk to everybody, but you give that almost energetic nod that. Because even if you can't see them properly, you look in their eyes and you give that nod. You reach to them on a compassionate,
on a different
heart
level. Things like "excuse me," or
thank you,
or "hope you're having a great day," and then moving on doesn't require much interaction, but it allows another person to know, hey, I exist, right?
I exist, and I
exist.
Matter.
Other people acknowledge that I'm existing. I am not, this ghost walking in this world. And you never know where your kindness will make the difference in somebody's day or impact somebody's life. And so the best thing that we can do is walk this world and treat people the way we would like to be treated. And everybody wants to be treated with kindness and compassion. Nobody really wants to come up and have everybody say F you to them and get out of my way, fool, or, why are you doing that? Nobody wants to be treated that way. So stop treating people that way.
And I think on that note, because I think we'll revisit this again, is anyone who's listening to this wants to contact us and tell us about any of the kind acts they've done or that they've told somebody else about this podcast so that they can hear it, because I want people to know that they matter. I don't want people to feel so desperate that they take their own lives. I want people to know that even if at the moment the world looks a really scary and fearful place, that actually there are amazing and beautiful things to be experienced. And I don't say that in a twee way. And I don't want people to feel disillusioned. We are not our jobs. We are not our families. We are not our schools. We are separate beings who in this process could learn more about ourselves than ever. But so people matter, and let's be kind to other people. Let's go back to that, moving out of the fear and the paranoia and into that space of showing some way of connecting with someone. Let us know how you did you do it? Did you set yourself a 30-day goal of smiling, nodding, being welcoming? And when you feel that urge, and we all get that, to judge or have a go at someone, or is he, how are they driving? All of that stuff that we feel inside, just realize that's just chaos that's in us for the moment. And it's okay. We're human, but let's try not to project that out and spill out on that. Let's try and be kind.
And when you do, because we're all quite aware that everybody has projected accountability. Hey, look, I'm so sorry. you did not deserve that.
Yeah.
Here's where I'm at. And I apologize. And I'm going to work on that behavior. That goes a long ways. It's part of that compassionate behavior, you know, the compassion project that people really deserve to have. And I agree 100%. I would love to hear the stories. Again, this is why we're doing this is for people to understand that you're not alone and that we truly do care and we do love you. And there is more of us that care and love than is made aware. And once you tap into that resource, you're going to really see that this is a community that we're trying to bring in. That this is a community of people that we want to hear your voice. We want you to know you matter. And we want you to know that no matter the circumstances, there is a way out. And we can do this together. We can do this on our own. Whatever way is chosen is the right way for you.
Mm-hmm.
But you are surrounded at all times with things that you cannot see that love you more than life itself.
Exactly.
And we are deserving of this compassion. We are deserving of this love, and we are deserving to be heard, witnessed, and acknowledged every day in any way that is healthy and necessary in your existence.
And I want to say amen to that, sister.
Woo, on the highest.
So on that note, what I'd like to end with is, and I think we've probably got a couple of meditations in line to address this, is just for a moment, breathe in and put your hand on your heart and feel that part of you, that compassionate part of you. And if you've not felt that before, maybe remember a time when somebody's been like that towards you, and feel the warmth of your hand on your heart. And take a slow, deep breath. And just feel the way you feel, whether you're stood or sat. And just allow your breath to drop and allow the sensation in your heart to get warmer. And imagine that the warmth of your hand is warming up your heart. And for some people, the heart can feel quite hard or cold or protected. But just for a moment, allow the warmth of your hand to magnify the deeper feelings of compassion and love. And spread that out, and just spread that out into the whole of your being, into your aura. And allow any calm, peaceful feelings to emanate. And we just do that for 10 seconds because it's something that you can do before you get your shoes on and walk out onto the street. Because when you're in that heart center, you can magnify and send out those warm feelings and enable them to be much more powerful. So on the last breath, and just say, I matter, I exist, I am. And we end there. Thank you, Danielle, for your time tonight.
So sorry. Thank you, Mel. That was beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.